Happy Monday, everyone. Hope y'all are doing okay. I'm Tiana Woodard, and I'm a Boston Globe reporter and Report for America Corps member. On a day-to-day basis, I usually cover the city's Black communities, but for today, I'm super grateful to moderate this discussion of a movie that does not need its own introduction, the 1996 heist film Set It Off. And for our discussion today, we have three just amazing powerhouse thinkers and creatives to discuss the in and outs of this iconic film. So first we have Dr. Saida Grundy, who's a feminist sociologist of race and ethnicity studies and an assistant professor of sociology and African American studies, as well as women and gender studies at Boston University. They're also the author of Respectable: Politics and Paradox in Making the Morehouse Man, which asks how, in light of an ongoing national reality and discourse about young Black men in crisis, the men of Morehouse College experience gender and masculinity at an institution that attempts to groom them as solutions to this crisis. Today, we also have Jessica Estelle Huggins, who is a Boston native and acclaimed filmmaker. Some of the various films that she's produced have been accepted into dozens of film fests around the country and have received many awards. They include Memoirs of a Black Girl, the Black Women Shine podcast, Perfect Day, Shy Voices, a poetic film series, and much more. And currently, Huggins works as a full-time producer at Another Age Productions, which is a full-service production company focusing on digital content. And last but absolutely not least, we have Kat Odechair, who's a Boston-based freelance producer, director, and cinematographer who specializes in documentary, music video, and film work. And she's also worked on season 2 of I Consider My Work Auntie, but most of y'all probably know her as Globe columnist Janae Osterholt in her beautiful Resistance series. Thank you three so much for taking the time to participate today. I'm excited to just pick your brains, and I'm sure the attendees are excited to hear from you too. And just for our attendees, a few quick housekeeping items. If you have any questions for our panelists, you can do that using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And I will be getting into those at about 3:30 or so about 30 minutes in. And this panel is also going to be recorded, so be warned, that's your last warning, but that also means that this will be available for you for your memories and anything you'd hope to do after that. So first off, we're going to go ahead and dive straight in. I know this film means so much and I want to make sure we can get to as much as possible. Just to start with you three, I know that all of us kind of have a personal relationship to this film, especially those of us in the Black community. I would love to hear from you three what your earliest memories are of this film and kind of what feelings or emotions it usually evokes for you. Whoever wants to start, I'll let y'all kind of popcorn it from there.
Okay, I can start.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining. I'm so honored to be in community with all of you today. Happy Monday. So Set It Off came out in 1996. I was 6 years old, but it was one of the many films that I snuck and watched on VHS in my parents' bedroom. I think I was like 12 when I actually saw it. And at that time, I just was like, whoa, these women all look like me. And they're carrying this entire film. So it was very much, I mean, a fan fave, Jada, especially at that time. I was really happy to see those types of stories where we're front and center. But I do remember thinking that a lot of these women were dealing with a lot of traumatic situations. And I think it's actually a really good early representation for me ahead of my film career to see how certain narratives are written about women and just like classism at its best. Like all of these women were low income. Majority, I would argue majority of people who do illegal things don't want to. They're just put in situations where they're just trying to survive. So those were kind of like some of the earlier memories I remember thinking, but also being really happy to see like all Black women just carrying this film.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, similar for me. I was raised, my parents came out of the Black arts movement. So I was raised with the context that Black arts was always connected to Black politics and liberation. And those were never disjointed. In fact, it meant that my household and community were very critical of popular arts, right? So My father was always bringing feminist film into our household, probably before he even maybe had a word for it, but Julie Dash and Ayoka Chinzera. And, we were always watching very progressively minded Black art on film. So when, F. Gary Gray, this like sort of these younger filmmakers came along, to me, those were kind of like new jack, filmmakers, right? That was like almost, because F. Gary Gray, was associated with these wonderful, music videos. So this was sort of like hip hop film. In the 90s was such like a golden era of just like young, hip hop filmmaking. So this being a major box office, as opposed to the plethora of independent filmmaking we had seen, it was pretty exciting because, these were names who, at the time were, again, like these were like hip hop gods. It was like, this was, Latifah, and this was Jada. And like, these were Black women who I already associated with something that meant something in terms of statement. And then F. Gary Gray was this lesser profile, but sort of very buzzworthy name. The film itself, to look back at it now, I saw it when I was like, 14, maybe 13 or 14. And so, I'm really budding in my adolescence. And I used to just really gravitate towards the depictions of Black women that were really fearless, but not fearless in a one-dimensional way, that were fearless and yet vulnerable. Like I really gravitated towards that. So this was a film, I think, Jada and Latifah's characters stand out to me as people who show amazing vulnerability on film. Literal vulnerability, spoiler alert, one dies. But also that Black women's fearlessness wasn't one-dimensional, wasn't caricaturish. And and I long for that golden age of hip hop cinema. I think I am perturbed by what is some of the highest grossing Black box office stuff now. I'm perturbed by the backslide we have taken in depictions of Black women. I'm distraught that Tyler Perry has built an empire on misogynoir, right? I'm really there, the relationship Black communities have with Black women on screen is almost like 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. And so that's why I think about, putting this film in that context.
Thank you so much. What about you, Kat?
Yes, that was a mouthful. Wow. I agree. So I can keep it short. I think as a person who grew up with like all brothers, I just remember being super excited about seeing Black sisterhood being depicted in media. Mm-hmm. And I feel like this is probably like one of my first illustrations of true friendship and sisterhood amongst unambiguous Black women on television. So I thought that was pretty special.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. You guys like kind of got into like the next question I was gonna ask, and I know we were kind of kicking before this about how I like was not even thought of when this film was released, and I think that Dr. Grundy like especially kind of got into how pivotal and just how like barrier and groundbreaking it was at the time. Just look like as people who like look at media and the way that it touches on Black feminism and intersectionality, I guess like whether it's like Dr. Grundy, who might have been a little older at the time compared to other ones, or any of you guys, like over this, like, I guess, art of like Black women and their portrayals in film, like, I guess, where does Set It Off stand in that art? Like, how did it break barriers at the time just to kind of, I guess, nail home the importance and the significance of this film?
It would be, what is the date on Daughters of the Dust? Is that also 1996 or is that 1994-ish?
I think it's earlier. Yeah.
It's a little bit earlier. I think it was, this was like a golden age of like of essence, a golden age of there was a lot of Black womanhood in media. And that's not to say that it was, all progressive, but there certainly was an idea that Black women had purchasing power in television and in film, right? So in television, we're seeing Living Single. We're seeing a number of things that are now catering, at that time, we're catering to this idea that like, oh, Black women have purchasing power. There's this demographic of Black women rising who are, outdoing their mothers in education, who are, for the kind of first time are seen as, independent of just sort of this in between of sort of, childhood and waiting on marriage, who are seen as young adults, young professionals, young, working class people, what have you. And, hip hop, we all have a complicated relationship with hip hop because hip hop was where I saw some of my strongest, women's voices, right? And then hip hop was also where I was taught that the worst thing you could be was a woman with a voice, right? So hip hop has always been this really schizophrenic art form when it comes to feminism. And, this was, absolutely, I think, in that moment, it was the idea of like, oh, there's this generation of Black women who aren't their mothers necessarily, right? So we weren't necessarily a Black power generation in that age, but we also weren't, white yuppies that were being so celebrated, in the 90s. We weren't part of the economic upturn under the Clinton era. We actually, we were the war on drugs, generation, right? And so I think this film was really important for, if nothing else, celebrating the idea that Black women were worthy of life and worthy of humanity, besides being, sort of professionals and, in a lawyer gig. Like everything else was telling us that, Boomerang, Boomerang is a, perfectly entertaining film. But everything else in that era was a real worship of the Black bourgeoisie. And this was one of the only films that I think where Black women who were working class, queer, what have you, were depicted in a way that they weren't the joke, right? Like in Friday, Black women who were working class were the joke. These women weren't the joke. And I think it's really important.
Yeah, I agree. I think seeing like 4 Black female leads for the first time in like crime and action was significant, specifically because I feel like typically the roles were of like love interest, right?
Yeah.
And also I think movies that kind of centered on Black impoverishment usually were portrayed by Black men. So I feel like Set It Off created a lane for Black women to tell the same story that often leaves us out. So yeah.
That's okay. Is there anything you wanted to add?
I actually was thinking about how I was trying to figure out if I've ever seen something earlier than Set It Off that represented or just had like a leading person who was woman and queer. And I think Queen Latifah might have been like Cleo. Cleo might have been my first example seeing an earliest example. But that's why I was like really thinking about it, like, have I seen them before this? But I don't think so.
I don't think so either. And I think what really fascinated about like me is that like a lot of times, I guess with a lot of queer depictions, that's kind of like their whole character. But it was just like, that was like, it was Cleo, but she's also queer. Like it wasn't like queer was her entire identity. I really admired the fact that they kind of just treated that as like one piece of her. And I think that they did it in a way I think was good, especially for the time. But I thank you so much for bringing that up. And I was like also kind of curious, this might be like more tailored to Jessica and Kat, but Dr. Grundy like definitely weigh in too. But from like a filmmaker perspective, are there like any scenes or any like storytelling techniques in Set It Off that stand out to you, or like I'm just curious to know that. I'm not a film expert, but I know that you guys are like beautiful storytellers, and I'm not sure if there's anything that you think is really pivotal or that you really like about this film from that perspective.
Wow, that is quite the question. Kat, you want No,
it's quite a question. It is quite a question. We might have to come back to that because I have to really think.
No worries, no worries.
I actually was going to say that I know intimacy coordinators, for those who don't know, I'd say maybe maybe like 7 years ago, intimacy coordinators started to become like a real important thing, especially in Hollywood, for any intimate, including sex scenes. And so I remember watching, that scene between Jada's character and Blair Underwood and thought, I hope they both were comfortable during this. Like, I understood the editing techniques, so like it was very sensual. But I also was just wondering if they felt comfortable and how many people were there, because part of intimacy work is not having so many people on set watching what's happening. So yeah, sorry to take it there, but that was like the first thing I thought of. Does everyone, because I am a producer, so I often think, are people comfortable first? Does everyone know what they need to do, what the expectations are? And also, are you comfortable being in whatever it is for you to execute your role?
Yeah, I mean, that's, as not a filmmaker, that's an important thing to think about, because if you're talking about a film being feminist, it has to ask those kinds of questions. Like, I've heard Spike talk about shooting love scenes, and Spike's love scenes run the gamut, right? Like, they're not all, I don't think Spike has made up, even his women-centered films are not feminist. In fact, some of his women-centered films are extremely misogynistic. But, I've heard him say, it was uncomfortable for me to shoot, to which I'm thinking, like, then how uncomfortable is it for it to act? And these are things like, if we were to really get into the politics of this filmmaking, like we, until they write the sort of tell-all of the production of this film, it would be great to know. And it'd be great to know for me how that stayed with the performers themselves. I mean, Jada, I think, has very progressive sexual politics, has talked about this, in her life, talked about this with children. And yeah, if we're talking about the ways we depict Black womanhood on screen, Black, femininities on screen, one of the things that, I think that this film was so important in doing is there are so few tropes that low-income Black women are allowed to be on screen. They can be a terrible mother, like in Lee Daniels' Precious, which is one of the most racist films ever made. It was Ronald Reagan's wet dream. That film depicted poor Black people as bestial animals who had the same lust for sex as they do for food. In fact, he intersplices sex with food. So Precious is getting molested by her father. It shoots to eggs frying in a pan. We're supposed to understand that the lust for sex for these people is like a lust for food. The only good Black people are light-skinned Black people, light-skinned mixed race Black people in that film. These films are atrocious. And so often they reiterate that when there's only a few tropes in which poor Black women are allowed to be on screen, right? You can be a Jezebel. You can be some sort of, over-sexualized, creature. You can be an abusive or at least emotionally isolating mother. You can be aloof and attached. You can be a vagrant, one-dimensional, homeless person. You can be a Felicia, right? Like in Friday. But there were so few other tropes. Claudine was before my generation, but shout out to Claudine. There were so few other tropes in terms of mainstream film, not, maybe not independent Black film, but in terms of mainstream Black film, there seems to be very little appetite for what low-income Black women are allowed to be, how they get to be sexualized on screen, what kind of control they have over that. And oftentimes we, to your point, only see their sexuality as something either to be mocked or that's like not really human, right? That's sort of their only function is sexuality.
Yeah, I did also want to add, going back to the filmmaking techniques, the music. I do love their usage of music in Set It Off, particularly the actual bank robbing scenes, because rewatching the film, I found myself still screaming at the same parts, like, go, go.
Me too.
So like I thought their usage of music was great, and it was like nice memory lane. Like, I was a kid when all of those hits came out. So like it was, yeah, I really appreciated that.
Mm-hmm.
Was there anything you wanted to add, or are you still thinking that we can get back to you close to the end too? No pressure. Okay. So I know that this film is pivotal because of like, it's just like four powerhouse Black women, but I think also this film is interesting in the way that it portrays Black men, whether it's like Keith or like Stevie or Luther. These Black men like are also kind of like driving forces between like the four protagonists like decisions they make throughout the film. And I guess I kind of wanted to ask you guys about, I guess, in what ways, I guess, did these archetypes, like, did they push the story, but in what ways did they like fall short in discussing or kind of painting Black masculinity at the time?
Oh, great questions. Blair Underwood is the one I remember most vividly. And the reason I remember that most vividly is because it was a very tender portrayal of Black love, right? It was, you know, despite their extreme class difference, it wasn't patronizing. She ultimately was in control, or at least in control of her side of that brief relationship. There was betrayal there, but it wasn't about her being a terrible person, right? It was the events betrayed him, but that was never used as the device for how trifling she is, right? And in fact, we get from, you know, this really beautiful scene, you know, that phone call, we get like his still has an emotional fondness for her. And I really love that, the bar, the dress, like these were very, very tender. And there were other Black men in that film, but the depiction I remember most is one that I think it was done well without being too Prince Charming, right? Because it could have been very on the nose, right? It could have been done in very predictable ways. But it was a very vulnerable, very tender exchange between two people whose lives crossed in more ways than they knew. And she wasn't reduced to something in that relationship, which I think is so important.
I think, her relationship with Keith definitely exhibited like her, I guess, getting her autonomy back in a sense, right? Especially after being taken advantage of throughout the film. So I agree on that.
Yeah. Yeah. And he doesn't, I mean, I also found myself thinking about protection, like that word kept coming up for me rewatching the film. Aside from the fact that these four women were constantly protecting one another, he also in some ways, he as in Keith, because when the police are at, their bank and he's like, oh, like you see that moment where he's like, oh, I know who that is. He doesn't say anything. He just has like this stoic look, but what's happening internally. So going back to what the good doctor was saying earlier about that phone call, like I remember that I was like, my goodness, like it didn't cut to him being with another woman or like doing anything like, I don't know, whatever. He really had like this emotional bond that had nothing to do with her class or what she did for a living. He just genuinely liked her as a person. And I feel like we don't see that very often, even today in films with us, with Black people in them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Do y'all remember any of the other like Black male characters? Is Keith the main one that stands out? Because honestly, I agree too that he was the most memorable. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I would just drag everybody else. So I don't know.
Luther.
Yeah, Luther. Yep.
Yeah, they're the boss. Yeah,
it's horrible.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Everyone.
I just feel like there was like no like genuine, positive, resourceful male figure in their life besides Keith, right? Without the idea that there should be like an exchange or something feeling like transactional in a sense. Yeah. And I felt like these women were just like so sacrificial when it came to like their male counterparts in the movie. And like from afar, you want to like admire, but then you understood that they were sacrificing at the extent of self too. So when it came to the Black men in this movie. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm reminded that Dr. Dre was in this movie, which of course he has a relationship with F. Gary Gray, so that makes sense. This was not a time where I was expecting us to unpack Dr. Dre's gender politics, but again, like I think, all these films, there are, tensions in which, aside from Blair Underwood's character, who his masculinity is not compromised at all, right? He still is enshrouded in his class privilege. He's still enshrouded in his power. Even his power to not snitch on them is still power. And then, a lot of these films, there's this sort of tug of war between like, oh, we'll sort of give an inch on, on depicting women, but we won't deconstruct men, and I think that this film absolutely stuck to that trope. I mean, again, it was a golden era of hip hop, and it's a particular West Coast hip hop film, F. Gary himself. So yeah, it's like it never unpacks Black men in ways, and their sort of masculinity is never, again, aside from Blair Underwood, I think their masculinity still falls into expected tropes about like, oh yeah, we were still some West Coast G's and they came to us to get guns, and that's never considered anything to diagnose in the filmmaking.
For sure. And just as a quick reminder to all like our attendees, I see that there are already some people that have submitted some questions that I'll get into in about a couple of minutes. Feel free to send anything to our panelists. I'm sure they're happy to hear from you and not just me. Oh my God, I literally just lost my train of thought. Oh, I was gonna ask you guys, I know that you kind of touched on this in terms of like some ways that I guess this film falls short. Like, are there some things that you wish that this film would have expanded upon more, whether it's thematics, cinema, is there a word for cinematography? Like an adjective for that, but you know what I mean?
Cinematography.
Like, yeah. What ways does it fall short, or what do you wish that it expounded upon?
There's a whole radical history of Black people, particularly on the West Coast of America at this time, and how they use guns. And guns were not simply tools of doing offensive violence, but self-defensive violence. And so, that's like a very wish listy type of things, but guns for Black people are not just the politics of like stick 'em up, right? Black women were running guns into courtrooms to liberate people. They were, like Black women, particularly this era in the West Coast, have a long history of standing. And guns were part of an entire idea of community uplifting, right? Uplifting. The gun violence itself was only part of the tapestry of like food justice and, economic justice. And so, this is it's an economic gimme story, right? They're getting justice for just being exploited laborers that could have theoretically been connected to something larger, but I think even that statement is useful.
Do you mind repeating the question?
Yeah, no worries. I was fumbling over my words. I guess I was just asking whether it's from like any standpoint, like what do you think set it off, like fell short in, or what do you wish you could have gotten more out of, whether it's from a film perspective, thematic, social commentary, like what are some, I guess, what were some questions that were left unanswered or they could have done better with this?
Yeah, I guess for me, I found myself thinking, I mean, also as just a storyteller, not even just filmmaking, you only have X amount of time to like pack in certain details.
For sure.
But I did find myself when I rewatched the film wondering about each of the four women in their individual family lives, even if it is like chosen family. But if we use or if we talk about Kimberly Elise's character, I was like, what's up with the dad?
Yeah.
Or everyone's mom and dad and like cousins, or even if you think about attendees, if you think about people in your own community and us here on the panel, you know, we don't just become who we are. There are things that happen. There's people that influence us. And so it did make me wonder after rewatching film, you know, what their upbringings were like, and, you know, who was there, who wasn't, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I guess from a cinematographer standpoint, like if I was to tackle this film, I think I would go with a more stylistic approach of like hyper-realism as a cinematographer. And like, I probably would use long focal lengths to separate the characters, to concentrate like on their individual stories, alongside like more dynamic camera movements. That's, I don't know, that's me. And also sound. For me, sound is like super important in film, like between the scoring and the sound design and like how immersive it can feel. I feel like that's what the movie lacked a bit, but the soundtrack was amazing for sure.
Okay, and with that, like we already have some questions, and the first one is from an anonymous attendee, and they're wondering, I guess, from your perspectives, like why do you think that the detective at the end of the movie let Jada Pinkett's character Stoney go, and especially since he didn't get like Vivica Fox's character get off, or Frankie when he, like I guess at the end of the movie where Frankie is killed, but Stoney is able to escape on the bus and get out of the country. What does that mean to you guys?
I thought about that too, but like I think it probably was just like a moment of like redemption after Jada's brother was killed earlier in the movie.
Yeah. Yeah, I was actually going to say this actually goes back to something that I wanted to talk about with the panel, and then obviously from the attendees. But having rewatched the film, Detective Strode was basically, I took him as a white savior. I took it as the filmmakers needed to have at least one white character that was like the good guy. And it wasn't until I rewatched the film where I was like, you know, because I wouldn't have had that language at 12 years old when I first saw the film. But to the attendees' question, and then going back to what you were saying, Kat, I think it was a moment of redemption. There was already one too many chaotic situations that was happening to all of these women that I think just as a character, he was like, we just got to keep it moving. Like, we just got to let her go. But at the same time, I wholeheartedly do not think that would happen in real life. That would not have happened in real life. Hence the good white guy. You need a good white character to get films at this caliber created. And so I wouldn't want to do that if I had to remake this thing. But yeah.
I also wonder how it tested. I mean, I guess this was still done in 1996. Like you test, you know, endings with markets, right? When was Dead Presidents? I think Dead Presidents was before Set It Off, was it? That we had. I think there were a number of crime movies, Black crime movies, not necessarily heist movies, in which there's, I mean, we just said Dead President 1995, so year prior. Thank you. And so, you know, there might have been a thing of this will test better if there's at least some hope at the end. And also, you know, the appetite for killing women on screen is really interesting because I don't know how that plays for killing Black women on screen. I know that white audiences do not like white women to die on screen. In fact, the only film I can think of where a non-fat white woman is murdered on screen, and that's not supposed to be the pivotal sort of like, you know, emotional gut-wrenching point, was Django, right? Where it's comedic, where she's killed from a distance, she's literally blown away by Miss Molly. It's comedic. I felt like that violated a contract with white audiences that you are not supposed to kill white women unless they are fat or whores on screen, right? There has to be a reason to kill a white woman on screen. And you know, I actually would love to know from like the film studies, you know, people, how it tests with Black women on screen and the death of Black women on screen. I would think that white audiences are not nearly as empathetic to Black women's deaths on screen, but Black audiences might be.
It's likely they didn't test us.
Yeah, not at all. Right. Because I feel like what was overlooked is like how Cleo died, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Excessive force. She was riddled by like 100 bullets, complete overkill.
Yes.
And like when we think of like Black Lives Matter movement, like it serves like as a reminder that Black women aren't exempt from harsh treatment at the hands of law enforcement. So I don't think we really talk about that as much.
And that was a choice to overkill her.
Yeah.
Most violent scene in the movie, and it's visited upon a Black woman who has no patriarchal contract. You know, like that was a choice to overkill. She's almost masculinized in that moment.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I felt like she was misgendered throughout the film too by Luther frequently, right?
Yeah, he always said he was like ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, that was like his thing. Yeah.
Another question that we have also from an anonymous attendee, it's kind of like a comment, but also a question. They were noting that they say that it's interesting that the Black man, or Keith, that's recalled positively, is the one with money, and that other male role models in the film are the opposite extremes. So like, I guess they're saying that there's not really a regular or well-rounded Black man in the film. It seems like they kind of exemplify extremes.
I agree. Yeah. And I think that is, again, due to this era, and we are still in this era in which morality is conflated with Black wealth and attainment. That Black people who do well economically must be better people. Yeah, which is not true. In fact, quite the opposite can be true. But we are still in a prosperity gospel moment of Black filmmaking.
And then, so the next one is from Karen. I think it was kind of also, y'all kind of already got into this with the first question, but kind of like asking more of what did you each think of the portrayal of the white cop or the detective? I know that Jessica kind of got, or y'all kind of got into it, but is there anything else that y'all didn't mention that y'all might want to add to what was already discussed?
Can you repeat that? I couldn't really hear you.
No, you're good. So Karen was asking what your opinions were on the, I guess, the portrayal of the white cop in the film. But we were kind of getting into with the first question about why they let Stoney go and killed Frankie. But if there was anything, you kind of guys kind of already got into it, but I'm not sure if there's anything else you wanted to add about that character.
Not that character, but I will say the other detective.
Yeah, the Black woman.
She made a lasting impression on me this time.
Me too.
But it kind of makes me think of just how law enforcement is, you know, go blue, like they protect their own. Like even that moment where in the first like 10 minutes of the film after the bank robbery, where Vivica's character is like, and you didn't even offer me a glass of water, sister. Yeah. And I was like, oh, yeah. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but we only got so much time on this panel. So.
And then the next question we have is from Jared, and it's posed specifically to Jessica. Jared was wondering if this film were remade today, what would you want to change and what you would want to keep the same?
Hi, Jared. I know Jared. Big shout out. I would not remake this at all. I think we have other stories to tell, but if I had to remake it, I'd make sure we would have a bomb soundtrack like the first time. I think I would definitely make sure we had that. And maybe I would set it for the East Coast, you know, going off of, maybe we could do that. That might be kind of fun, more congested, but we'd have to work it out.
May I add that this film was already remade and it's just called The Town, and they removed all the Black women from it and they kept the entire plot and just remade. And, you know, as we, you know, are in Boston, I had a conversation with a friend once and he said, you know, Boston is the last basically genre of urban, particularly crime films, because you can have all white casts, right? Like you can put Boston in an all white setting and that's not atypical, right? And so, yeah, Ben Affleck copied and pasted set it off and put it to white boys and put the exact same plot, just like the president NBC copied and pasted Living Single. Queen Latifah need to get her reparations. Stealing everything she does. Like that's what I mean. Like Black culture, at this time and at every time, was so innovative in its storytelling that these things were literally just straight up plagiarized for mass markets. And the town is exactly it's white boys who are second generation bank thieves, and they're trying to get out the hood too. And I'm like, it takes Black women's strife and takes all of them out of it, guts them from it, and says, no, this is really just, this isn't all urban lives matter.
And then the next question we have on here is anonymous, and it's kind of a comment of saying that they wish the 4 protagonists had gotten away without losing their lives or having to just uproot themselves from their own country. What do you guys think of that? Because that was something I was thinking too.
Don't we all? Better ending.
Now that is where it got really actual political statement. There were many Black people and Black power movements who said that, America is not an option for us to actually get free, that there is no, Du Bois got out of the country. I mean, there's the number of Black people who up and left is remarkable. And that is actually, I think, a very loud whistle, a political statement, that there will be no safe harbor for a Black woman in America.
Yeah, and where did she end up? Was it said?
Mexico?
Island, was it Mexico? It was
Mexico,
somewhere.
I believe.
Yeah, Mexico. Yeah.
I mean, in hindsight, I feel like when you think about the movie, like they just never benefited from these robberies, right? Like they lost in the end. So the fact that they like resorted to just robbing banks as their only means of getting out the hood, it just kind of seemed like they were already accepting defeat and they knew their fate. So I feel like they died in vain,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say also the amounts, like today it's very different.
Yeah.
All that money fit on a table. Even if those are $100 bills, we are talking about fractions of what the SNL scandal took from Black communities in the same era. We're talking about fractions of what Wall Street robbed Black people every day, right? Like, and this is often, I think that is one of the more maybe decided and maybe, arguably more realistic parts is that, class exploitation, labor exploitation is so replete that even $500 feels like, like temporary liberation, even though that money, as soon as you pay bills, is gone. But like the idea of what you would do just to get by a couple months becomes really extreme. That all that money fit on a table. It wasn't, they were probably talking, what, a couple $100,000?
Right.
Between 4 people?
Yeah, the biggest amount was 90.
Yeah, I think it was 90.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Did you guys hear that there's probably like a sequel to this?
I did not know that.
Leave it alone.
I'm not too sure, right? But like I wouldn't want the movie to be reimagined at all, but like I think I'll be excited for a sequel. Because like then I'll think about the story of Stoney being in Mexico, right, with her newfound wealth. We see this journey of like rebirth. And then one thing, when a Black woman shaves her head, just know a breakthrough is on its way.
Took off the brain braid.
And the movie ended with her calling Keith. So there might be a love story with that. So if there's a sequel.
She's like, find your way to the airport.
I think that's all the time we have for today. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get to all of these questions, but thank you guys so much for sharing your personal experiences, being vulnerable, and also just opening my eyes to things I didn't notice about this film. I appreciated it, and I'm sure that all of the participants did too. And that's all for today. And Thank you guys again for tuning in to this session for this year's Black History Month Film Fest. I hope you all have a great rest of your week. Bye for now.